Okay, today's topic we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia Daf Kuf Bet. Shavua Tov to everyone. This week's learning is sponsored by Joy Benatar in loving memory of Miriam Quint David on her 8th year at site. Proud mother and grandmother, passionate Jewish educator, pastry, ice cream, and needlework enthusiast. Today's daf is sponsored by Batsheva Pava in loving memory of her father's family, who arrived at Auschwitz only a few days before Shavuot. His mother, Batsheva, and son Moshe Meshel and daughter Adal were taken to the crematoria only hours after arrival. My grandmother was a big ba'alat tzedakah. My father used to say that if he did not hide his pants at night, she would give them away to a poor person. Hashem inkom damam. And today's daf is dedicated to Noah Argamani, Almog Meir Jan, Andrei Kozlov, and Shlomo Ziv, who were rescued from captivity, and in memory of Arno and Zmira, who was killed in the rescue mission. We are thrilled at the return of the hostages, but at the same time, we mourn the loss of Arno and pray for the safe return of the remaining 120 hostages. Okay, we're going to get started with the top of our daf. We're going to finish up the mezuzah sugya and move back to other issues relating to a socher and a maskil, a tenant and a landlord, which obviously the mezuzah issue is related. Tanu Rabanan, beginning of our daf. Hamaskir bayit lechavero al hasocher la'asot lo mezuzah. When you rent a house, it's a very commonly known law. It's the person who rents who has to put up a mezuzah. So if you come into an apartment, this happened to me in Israel, where I came into an apartment, there were no mezuzahs. I was young at the time. I had to go buy mezuzot for the entire apartment. Ukishu yotze, and this is the biggest issue, which is kishu yotze lo yitzlenu biyado v'yetze. So, okay, I bought mezuzahs, but then when I leave the apartment, I have to leave them there. I can't take them off. So even if the person after you doesn't need it, or doesn't want, specifically want them, but you have to leave them. But minochri, if you rent from a Gentile, and the commentaries say not only rent from a Gentile, but if the next renter will be a Gentile, notla biyado v'yotze, then you can take them with you. Okay, so how do we get around this? Because it's really a bit of an issue. So there are poskim who say that if you put them up with a condition that you're taking them down, if you put them up kind of temporarily, there's a possible way to get around this issue that you can buy the mezuzot and take them with you when you leave. But in general, the basic halacha is you actually have to leave them. There was a case of someone who took the mezuzahs with them, v'yatza, and left. V'kavar ishto shnei banav. This is the way the Gemara or the Mishnah likes to tell stories, right? There's a braita, and his wife and children died. Okay, now why? What's the connection? Well, some people say midah keneged midah. The mezuzah is supposed to protect, and therefore his family was no longer protected because he took the mezuzahs with him instead of leaving them when he should have been leaving them. But now the Gemara assumes that since this comes at the end of the braita, that it's referring to the case where he was renting from a Gentile. So they say, what does this contradict what it said before? Because it sounded like he left even though it was owned by a Gentile and his family died. Amar Rav Sheshet Aresha. Rav Sheshet means no, we're referring to the earlier part, meaning it was from a Jewish landlord, and that was why it was an issue. So anyway, it's a tough story. It's hard to read these stories and, like such a direct relationship between Sachar and Onesh, right? It's hard for us to get that so strong. I mean, we understand the concept, but, these stories are very stark in the way they put things out there. Now we're going to move on to the next topic. Hazevel shabal habayit. We have this line in the Mishnah that we want to understand better. The manure is the balabayits. We're talking about objects that are in the courtyard, which is outside the house. You rent a house, and there's manure in the courtyard. We don't yet know who produced the manure, why it's not considered yours. If you're renting the house, shouldn't the courtyard be yours as well? And the only thing you get is the ashes and other things that are at the bottom of the oven and the burners that you can keep, but not anything, because that's something you create, but not the manure. So b'mayaskina, what exactly is the case here? If you rented also the courtyard, and they were your animals that created the manure, your oxen, why should the manure be given to the landlord? It's completely yours. So it can't be that. There also can't be this case. If it's a courtyard that they didn't rent out. In other words, you rented the house, but not the courtyard. And the oxen belong to the landlord. Well, pshita, it's obvious that they're the landlords. The courtyard's the landlords. The animals are the landlords. Why does the Mishnah need to tell you this? So, Lotzricha, the Gemara concludes it must be a case. And this is going to lead us into a whole sugya here. Bechatzer demaskir v'torah da'al atume al makamuba. The case in the Mishnah is the courtyard belongs to the landlord. The landlord rented you a house. And the assumption is he rented you the house. When he rents you a house, it's the house, not the courtyard. And the oxen are oxen that came from random people. Now, when we've learned about these houses and the spaces, and especially in Eruvin, right, usually there's houses which open up to courtyards, which open up to mavois, alleyways, which open up to the Rishut HaRabbi, the public domain. But in this case, and not every case had a mavoi, sometimes the houses open up to courtyards, which open up to the street. And in houses that open up to courtyards, that open up to the street, oftentimes people who are in the street, who let's say came to the shuk and don't have anywhere, the Meiri describes this well, and don't have anywhere to go to feed their animals because the shuk is just too busy. So they move up to the side into the courtyards and they feed their animals there, and their animals do their thing there, and you end up with manure. And then they leave it because they don't need to take their manure with them. But for you, you can use it as fertilizer. So that's the issue here. Who do they belong to? Now, since it's hefker ownerless, and it's in the courtyard, and it's left in the courtyard of the owner, the landlord, so therefore it belongs to the landlord. That's what the Mishnah is telling us. That's the way the Gemara understands it. And this interpretation can be further supported by Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, who was an Amora in Israel. That's why it was called Rabbi. This Mishnah, actually, what they say is this Mishnah could be used to support. In other words, once we explain the Mishnah this way, it can be used to support Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina says. To Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, a person's courtyard acquires things for that person, even if they don't know about it. Here we have a case. Let's say you're renting my house. So you're living in the house. The courtyard is mine, but I'm not there. And other people's animals wander through the courtyard, leave their manure. It's mine, even though I'm not there. Because again, it's hefker, ownerless. But ownerless is acquired by whoever takes it. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, which is supported by the way we just read the Mishnah, well, my courtyard can acquire something for me even if I don't know about it. Right? We've talked a lot about courtyards acquiring with get, if you remember. The husband can put the get in the chutzner of the woman and becomes hers because things that go in the chutzner. So here we have it. Rabbi Rabbi Chanina says, my courtyard can acquire things even without my knowledge. And therefore, I get that as the landlord, since I didn't rent you my courtyard, I just rented you my house. The courtyard's mine. Anything that goes in that courtyard is automatically mine, even if I don't take it. Well, we're now going to have three difficulties with this statement of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina from Tanaitic sources. First one, Meitive, and this will take us all the way to the Mishnah at the bottom of Amud Aleph. Imamal, if somebody gets up and says, Kol mitziot she'yavo letocho hayom tikneli chatziri. Any lost items, I say at the beginning of the day, any lost items that fall into my courtyard today happen to get there, right? Again, they're hefker, they're ownerless, and I want to say anything that's ownerless that is a lost item that gets, again, a lost item that doesn't need to be returned, that falls into my courtyard today, I want my courtyard to acquire it. Meaning, if somebody else walks through and picks it up, they don't get it because I'm saying it's going to be mine. Even though, right now, according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, what will we say? First of all, you wouldn't even need to say this because it would happen automatically. Second of all, if you would say it, it would certainly work because you have the ability to acquire things in your courtyard even though you don't know about them. And here you're talking about something that gets into your courtyard that you don't even really know about. Well, the Breita says, Lo amar klum. It's ineffective. If you walk into my courtyard after I made that statement and you find some lost item, someone leaves $100 bill on the floor of my courtyard, you can take it. And if we hold by Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, who said, my courtyard can acquire things even without my knowledge, why is this meaningless? To which they explain, there's two kinds of courtyards. There's ones that are protected, ones that aren't protected. The only time my courtyard can acquire things without my knowledge, like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina says, is if it's a protected space, like a closed courtyard. It's not a place where everybody wanders through. It has to be somewhat protected for, okay, what exactly protected, what exactly not? Good question where we draw the line, but we're going to now distinguish between a protected courtyard and a non-protected courtyard. If it's unprotected and like everyone can just walk through freely, then that doesn't work. Now you have to wonder if it's protected, then how did all the manure get there? Good question. I don't have an answer to that question, but maybe I opened the gate or something and then it came in. I don't know exactly. But the point being, in a protected space, that's when my courtyard can acquire things. If it's unprotected, it can't. So I can't get up and say in my unprotected courtyard where kind of everybody comes through, and therefore nothing that falls in there could really be mine automatically because it's all somewhat open here. That's what they say. We're going to have a little bit of a problem with this, but we'll resolve it. But then the second part of the Braita, if we're talking about a courtyard that's not protected, then the second part of that Braita makes no sense, which we haven't read yet. Let's read it now. Yatzalo shein mitzia be'ir. Tvarav kayami. If there's a big rumor in town, everybody knows some mitzia fell into my courtyard. Everybody's talking about it. Okay, I don't know exactly what the situation is, but it somehow becomes noted. Everyone knows that something came into my courtyard and I had said this statement, anything that falls into my courtyard is mine. It works. That would work if people are talking about the fact that this item came into my courtyard. Now, if it's an unprotected space, then again, well then, why should it work? What's the difference if people know that this item came into my courtyard or don't know? It should have no bearing on the halacha. To which they explain, no. Before we distinguish between a protected courtyard and not protected courtyard. And once we say the Braita is all in a non-protected courtyard, why do we have this distinction of people know, people don't know? Well, the answer is, once people know and are talking on the street that some lost item came into my courtyard, like an animal wandered in, nobody knows whose it is, and there's no way to identify it, that animal becomes mine because it's as if my courtyard is protected. Since everyone's talking about it, no one's going to then come over and take it because they'll know that they took it out of my courtyard. So even though it's not a protective courtyard, it becomes like a protective courtyard because everybody knows about it, that it's already in my domain. So even though I didn't know it got there, right? But once everyone's talking about it, it's as if I've acquired it. Even though the courtyard's not protected, it puts it like a protected courtyard. Okay, so we've resolved this issue with a source that seemed to say that your courtyard doesn't acquire by distinguishing between a protected and a non-protected courtyard. And then the halacha becomes that Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina really only said it in a protected space, not in an unprotected space where everybody wanders in, then my courtyard can't acquire things. Second difficulty, meitive. And here's a Braita that's similar. Part of it is similar to our Mishnah, but then it's going to talk about other things. A different variation of the case. Zevel hayotze min hatanur min hakirayim, which we already said belongs to the tenant. The tenant gets to keep the things that are in the oven or the burners. And hakolet min ha'avil. What does it mean, hakolet min ha'avil? We're talking about dung that fell from the animal. And let's say I hung a pail underneath the animal and the dung went into the pail. Okay, that means it was kolet min ha'avir. It went into the airspace and then into my vessel. Harehu shelo. That already becomes mine. So if I have an animal in the courtyard and I put a pail hanging underneath and the dung goes into the pail, that becomes mine. Okay, if I'm renting the house, and it's the courtyard of the house that I'm renting, again, the courtyard's not mine, courtyard's yours as the landlord. I've now switched too soon. Maybe I should switch it back. But I'm the landlord, you're the tenant. You put on the animal this pail, it catches the dung, it's yours. So now the question, and then there's this other line which we'll explain soon. The dung that's in the barn or in the courtyard, shel balabayit. But the dung in the barn in the courtyard belongs to the owner. We'll get back to that line at the end. That's after we finish with this difficulty number 2. We'll just go back to the Braita for a minute to finish up and understand that line. But the line that is bothering us right now is kolet min ha'avil. Because let's just imagine, okay, it's a little unpleasant to imagine, but the dung leaves the animal. Now, on its way into this pail that I've hung, it goes into the airspace of the courtyard. What did Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina say? Chatzer shel adam koneh shelo midato. So theoretically, in those few seconds before it drops into the pail, it's in the airspace of the chatzer. And the truth is, we've seen in other sugyas, airspace of a space acquires something. So just like the chatzer, it's like it's in the chatzer because it's in the airspace. So in Ita lahad Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina da'amar chatzero shel adam koneh lo shelo midato kolet mi'avir my habe shelo. If Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina is right that the courtyard acquires it, then why should it belong to the tenant? Avir chatzerohu. It already went into the airspace of the chatzer. So the first easy answer is Abai, who says, Amar Abai bimadbik kli b'shulei para. Well, it's a case where I hung the pail on the animal, okay, where it didn't get into the airspace. I hung it right by the bottom of the animal, by where the dung comes out, and it went straight into there without actually entering the airspace of the court. And that's a very easy way to respond. But we're going to have some other responses. So Rava says, Rava Amal, Avir she'ein safo lanuach lav kimunach. Rava says, when we talk about it entering the airspace of the courtyard, that's only if it's not going to settle there. In other words, if it's not going to settle there, then it's not like it had landed there. So since this dung, okay, again, time in a timeline, the dung starts off in the animal's body. It leaves the animal's body, goes into the air of the courtyard, which we thought meant it's going to be acquired by the courtyard, according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. Then it falls into the pail. So Rava says the following: Avil she'ein sofo lanuach. If it's not going to eventually rest on the ground and it goes through the airspace, but it's going right into a vessel, whether it's attached to the animal, not attached to the animal, and a few feet down, doesn't make a difference. It's lav kimunach dami. It's not like it landed in the courtyard, because from the beginning it wasn't going to land in the courtyard. Okay, from the beginning it was clear it wasn't landing in the courtyard. Therefore, when it enters the airspace in between, that's not considered a case where the courtyard would acquire. It's only that if it's on its way down, before it actually lands, assuming it's going to land, then it's acquired by the courtyard. Now they say, wait a minute. Umi pshita le Rava v'hamiv ba'ile la. How could you say this is obvious to Rava? In other words, right now it sounds like this is clear to Rava that since it was going to land in a vessel, right, it's not considered like it went into the airspace. But, right, and that basically, if it's not going to land there, basically we say, okay, let's just say it very clearly so we'll see whatever the difficulty is. If it's not going to land there, then it's not considered that it got into it's owned by the courtyard. But in a different situation, Rava asked this as a question. And here it's a different case, and eventually we're going to distinguish between the cases, but let's try to understand the similarity first. Rava asked the following question. We saw this at the beginning of our Masechet. Debai Rava. Zarak arnaki bepetach ze, v'yatzta bepetach ze mahu. I take a wallet, a bag of money, and I throw it. I don't want it anymore. It's hefker, ownerless. And I throw it through your house, let's say. Goes in one door, out the other door. And I threw it from the beginning, aiming it to go totally out your second door. It went through the airspace of your house. So now this is the same kind of situation. It's in airspace of your house, but it's not going to land there because I threw it, I have good aim, right? I threw it in one door and out the other door. So it went through your airspace, but it didn't land and it wasn't supposed to land. So Rava didn't know, mahu. Is it avir she'ein safo lanuach kimunach? I mean, he uses the same language. Is it, right? Is this in the airspace where it's not ever going to land? But that's considered anyway like it did land because it was in the airspace. Olav kimunach dami, or do we say it's not like it landed? So why here is he so sure that it's avir she'ein safo lanuach is not kimunach, and there he says avir she'ein safo lanuach, maybe it is, maybe it's not. To which they distinguish and say no, there's a difference because hatam lo mifsek v'lo midi. There was no barrier when it went through the airspace of your house, my wallet. There was no barrier between the air and the ground. And therefore, since it theoretically didn't, but it theoretically could, as it was in the airspace with no separation between the air and the ground, that's why he's not sure. Maybe it's as if it landed on the ground, even though it didn't and it won't, or maybe not. But in our case, hacha mifsek kli. Here, there was a space, there was something blocking the airspace and the ground. In other words, the idea is that a courtyard acquires it when it lands in the ground, because then it's settled there. And if it's in the air above the ground and could land on the ground, then maybe it's like it's settled. That's the whole question. And that's why he debated when it went through the airspace, because it was in the air, could have fallen on the ground, even though it really couldn't have, but theoretically was above the ground without any separation. So maybe we view that as if it was on the ground. But in our case, it went through the airspace, but then was going to, no matter what, fall right into a vessel. There was a vessel blocking it from getting to the ground. Remember, the ground belongs to the landlord and the vessel belongs to the tenant. So because it was in the airspace, but about to go into a vessel that belonged to the landlord, the tenant, it wasn't considered like it landed on the ground. That was clear to Rava. Whereas the case where there was nothing blocking was unclear to Rava. And that's how we resolve that difficulty with Rava. So again, we have two explanations. Either we're going to talk about either we're going to say it's because the dung fell right into the vessel and the vessel was up against it, never even went into the airspace. It was up against the animal. Or we say, according to Rava, even if it wasn't up against, the fact that it went through airspace first, since there was something blocking it from getting onto the ground, that's what gives us our ruling that in this case, it's considered the tenant's, because it's the tenant's vessel. Now we just want to finish. Okay, this was the second question. We have a third question, but before we get there, I promise we get back to the bright 10 those lines, sheberefet b'shabachatzer. So the simple reading is, if there's any dung in the courtyard or there's any dung in the barn, hare elu shel baal habayit. This belongs to the owner. The assumption being that when you rent a house, you don't rent the court, right? It doesn't include a basic rental agreement of a house, doesn't include the courtyard, doesn't include the barn. Tarte, so the Gemara says, why do you need both? It's obvious. In other words, if it doesn't include anything outside, what's it telling us? So Amar Abai Hachikama. Abai rereads this and says it means, the way it should be read is, shebarefet shebachatzer. Talking about the barn that's in the courtyard. What is he telling us? Hare elu shel baal habayit, those belong to the owner. And Amar Rav Ashi comes and explains what we get from Abai here. Zot omeret hamaskir chavero stam lo hiskir refet sheba. We're now talking about a different case. We're talking about a case where I rented, or you rented, it doesn't matter, the house and the courtyard. Okay? Now, before we were talking about you rented a house and not the courtyard. Now you rented the house and the courtyard, and the assumption is the refet in the courtyard, though, is not included in your agreement. And that's what the Braita is telling you. That in a case where you rented the courtyard, still the barn is not included in that agreement. The barn and the courtyard is considered a separate entity, and you would have to have rented it separately for it to be considered yours to rent. Okay, third question against Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. This is the part that's a little bit more complicated. We're going to get into the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKen. We get into two issues here. We're talking about dovecotes, okay, where there are the different kinds of places where doves would congregate often. Okay, some people had them. We're going to talk about Yonei Shovach and Yonei Aliyah. Now, Yonei Shovach is where you had a dovecote, like an area that was kind of designated for doves to go in and out of. Or you had a second floor where there were areas where the doves would hang out. So now they're not really your doves, okay? They're not doves that you bred in your house, but they're doves that go flying. They go into your dovecote and then they leave, and then they come back and then they leave. And there's sugyas that talk about this, that they're kind of like yours because they always come back. And if you want to catch them one day, they'll be there for you to catch, and therefore they're somewhat yours to the extent that we're going to talk about this. There's gezel mipnei darkei shalom. If someone steals them, even though they're not really owned by you, they have to return them because of darkei shalom, for ways of people getting along with each other. You know, they're kind of like yours, even though technically speaking, they're not really owned by you. And we're going to learn, okay, we'll read it right now. Yonei Shovach v'Yonei Aliyah. So meitibei means we're bringing a difficulty on an Amora from a Tanaitic source. Yonei Shovach v'Yonei Aliyah chayavim b'shiluach. They're chayav in shiluach haken, meaning if you have doves there that have eggs, you have to send away the mother bird before taking the eggs. And asurot begezel mipnei darkei shalom. And if somebody steals them, now here they think actually they're talking about stealing the eggs. They're chayav because of darkei shalom. Okay, you can't steal the eggs because those eggs, again, are somewhat belonging to the owner. Now you have to say somewhat, not really, because if really, then it would be gezel by Torah law. So in Ita lahad amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina chatzero shel adam konalo shalom midato. Now if you hold, now where is this Yonei Aliyah or Yonei Shovach? They're in your courtyard. So if they're in your courtyard, okay, for sure the Shovach, the ones in the dovecotes, if they're in your courtyard, then what did Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina say? They're yours. Now, assuming, right, the bird's not, but the eggs, yes. Okay, the bird's not because the birds fly and they move. That's not, remember we talked about chatzer mishtameret? That's definitely not mishtameret. They're going to fly away. But the eggs come into your nest in your, right? There's a nest in your courtyard. Courtyard is kona shalom midato, without your knowledge. So these eggs should be yours already. What's the problem if they're yours already? Well, kare kan ki kare prat lemezuman. Now the psukim that talk about shiloh haken talk about ki kare ken sipor. If a nest of a bird happens to be there, but not that it's mizuman, not that it's yours. Like you put it there, you set it up. Now, if your courtyard acquires without your knowledge, then the eggs become yours. If the eggs are yours and owned by you, that's not ki kare. The pasuk says ki kare, it just happened that they ended up here. But if as soon as the eggs come out, they're yours, well then it's not ki kare. And then you shouldn't be chayav in shiluach haken. It's an interesting halacha why if they're yours, you're not chayav in shiluach haken. I'm not going to get into that, but that's the assumption. So it's not even an assumption. That's the drasha. So how do we explain this? We have to come up with a way that these eggs aren't yours. Because if they're yours, then there's no mitzvah of shiluach haken. So now they say, I'm a Rav. Rava gives the first answer. There's two answers here. Beitza b'yitziat ruba hudi chayv ela b'shiluach. U'mikna lo kanya ad nafla lachatzeva. He's going to say that this braita that talked about that you're chayv in shiluach haken is only when the eggs are most of the way out of the mother bird, but not fully out. If they're mostly on their way out, then they're not acquired yet by your courtyard. Because they're only acquired by your courtyard when they come into the nest. They haven't fully come into the nest because they're still part of the bird. And if they're part of the bird, remember the bird's not owned by you, the bird's going to fly off. So since you only, again, b'yitziat ruba, that's when you're chayav in shiluach. This braita was only, and then it's a little bit weird, but it's what we call an ukimta. This braita is only in a case when you haven't yet, right, the egg hasn't yet left fully the mother bird. And mikna lo kanya, and it's not yet acquired by you until it actually comes into the nest and is fully out of the mother bird. So when it says you're obligated for shiluach, is only mikame, only before it's tipol lechatzero, before it falls into your courtyard. So now they say, well, if that's the case, why are they forbidden mishum gezel? If they haven't yet left the mother bird, then you should be chayav in gezel. To which they say, no, iman. No, we're talking about the mother and the bird is chayav mishum gezel. Because even though they're not owned by you, like I said before, we basically have this issue of the bird is somewhat yours to the extent that nobody can take it. So even though the eggs aren't yours yet, you're still chayav mishum gezel if you steal the mother with the birds mostly inside them, or mostly out, but right. Either which way, the bird and its eggs are somewhat yours because even if the mother bird flies away, you assume the mother bird will come back. And anybody who does this, it takes it from you is basically creating a bad dynamic between you and them and shouldn't do it. Or another possible way to resolve this, why are they forbidden mishum gezel if they're not even yours at all, right? They're still in the mother bird. Ibait ema lo lama labetzim, not the mother. No, you are chayav for stealing the eggs. And why is that? Even though they haven't yet fully come out of the mother bird, because midinapik ruba da'atei lafe. Once the eggs start coming out most of the way out, okay, we always talk about when it's most of the way, it's as if it's almost the whole way. You've already assumed these eggs are going to be yours. So if somebody comes and steals them, again, they're not technically yours. And that's why it's not gezel by Torah law, but it is theft by rabbinic law because the rabbis instituted this. Since you assumed they were going to be yours, then if somebody steals it, it's gezel mishum darkei shalom. So to review this answer and the question, now we started with, if Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina says your chatzar acquires it, why are you chayav in shiluach haken here? You shouldn't be, because it's yours. And once it's yours, there is no mitzvah of shiluach haken. To which we say it's not yours because we're talking about this very small stage, this window, when the eggs are mostly out of the mother bird. You can't take the eggs without sending the mother bird away because again, that is a case of ki kare. They're not yet yours. And then we had to just resolve, well, then why is there a gezel issue if they're not yours? And then we said, well, the gezel anyway is an in-between. Either it's the mother we're worried about, which again, the birds would just be secondary to the mother, meaning all of it would be theft because of darkei shalom, because you assume even if the mother bird runs away, she'll come back. Or once they're out majority, it's as if you assumed they were going to be yours. So if anyone steals them, it's a problem of darkei shalom. Second answer to this difficulty of, aren't they yours? Okay, so again, Rava said they're not really yours because only Yatzarubo, and he gave a very small window to this Braita to apply. Now we have a different answer. Hashta Amar, which is going to be even after they come into your nest, they're still not really considered yours. And why is that? Hashta Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Now, since we already know that Rav Yehuda says the following in the name of Rav, we'll see what it is. We now have a different answer to our question. Asur liskopa bitzim kozman sha'em rovetzet alehem. Shenemal. Okay, you cannot take the eggs. It's forbidden for you to take the eggs. That's the mitzvah of shiloach haken, until the mother bird flies away, right? Until you send away the mother bird. How do we know this? Because it says shalach to shalach ta'em, send away the mother bird. The hadar et habanim tikachlach, and then it says and take the sons, right? The eggs, or again, that's the eggs or the chicks once they're born. Afilu tema denafla lalachatzero, even if they fell into your courtyard, even though Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina says your courtyard acquires, not in this case. Why? If you can technically, and you come with this interesting thing, halachically it's forbidden for you to take the eggs as long as the mother bird's there. That means, therefore, anytime you can actually take something, then Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina's halacha hits in. Then your chatzar can be koned. But if you're not allowed to take something halachically, like these eggs, while the mother bird's still there, well, then your courtyard can't acquire it for you either. So your courtyard is only allowed to acquire things that you halachically are allowed to acquire yourself. So then they say, okay, so that's our answer. Even if they fell into your courtyard, in this case, there's an exception. As long as the mother bird's still there, which is what we're talking about, why there's still a mitzvah of shiluach haken, because you haven't acquired the bird yet, since you can't, the eggs, since you can't take it until the mother bird flies away, then your courtyard can't acquire it either. It's a very interesting theory, but since it's halachically forbidden, then the regular laws of a courtyard acquiring something for you, they can't acquire. Now we have to just explain one other thing. Same thing we have with the first answer. How do you explain that it's forbidden begezel? If they're not yours, then why would it be forbidden? Right? If you already sent away the mother bird, then of course the eggs are already in your courtyard and they're already yours, in which case get them al it should be total theft by Torah law, not by rabbinic law. And and if you didn't, well then, habai shiluche, then you have to send the mother bird, and until then, you're not zochet, they're not yours. So why would it even be a darkei shalom problem? To which the answer, bekatan de lav bar shiluachu. We're talking about a case where a minor stole them. Now, what's the uniqueness of a minor? A minor's not chayav in mitzvot. So when a minor comes, the mother bird is still hovering. You're not allowed to take the eggs, but the katan took the eggs anyway. In other words, what we said now is you can't really be zochet to the eggs until the mother bird you send away, but not a cut because you're chayav to send the mother bird away. But the minor comes to steal it. The minor can actually take the eggs because the minor has no mitzvah, isn't commanded a mitzvot, doesn't have to send away the mother bird. So when the minor steals it, the minor has to return it because of darkei shalom, because they stole eggs. They could actually take it because they're not obligated in the mitzvah, and they'd have to return them because of darkei shalom, to which the Gemara asks, what? Darkei shalom? What do you mean? How could you apply a mitzvah of darkei shalom to a minor? So they say no. The kid comes home with these eggs and says, oh, Dad, look what I found. Eggs in a nest, that a bird was hovering over them. And the father says, okay, you didn't do the mitzvah shluch haken, but okay, you're not obligated. You took them. Well, I have to return them now because even though they weren't really owned by the person yet, but they kind of assumed they'd be owned by them, and they'd get very angry at me if they knew we stole them. The father is obligated to return them on behalf, the fact that the son stole. Okay, so again, what we had was the third question against Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina from this bird case, and we had two ways to resolve it. Now going back to the next Mishnah. Hamaskir bayit l'chavero l'shana. We're not going to have more disagreements from landlords and tenants. So the landlord rents a house to the tenant for a year. And then, if you might remember, how does Ibor Shana work when it comes to Adar, and they're not sure it's going to be, whether Pesach's going to be in the spring or not. Sometimes they decide to add another month. Let's say they add another month, and we had a rental agreement for a year. A year is 12 months or 13 months, right? We don't go by the the English or Latin year, we go by right now the Gregorian calendar, but we go by the Hebrew calendar. So now a year is 13 months. So the socher gets a free month's rent, basically, because the rental agreement was for a year, whatever the year comes out to be. But if you say I'm renting to you for 12, price per month, then you're going to have to pay. So the maskir gets the landlord gets obviously the extra month's rent. There was a case in Sipori where he rented a bathhouse from his friend. Now here it's a little tricky. He said 12 zahav for a year, 1 dinar per month, right? Which is 12 per year, right? That's 1 per month. But he said both. Moving out of bet. The case came before Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. They say we split it 50-50. So the Gemara immediately jumps on this and says, Maaseh stole. What? The Mishnah set up 2 cases. One where you said per year and the tenant wins out. One where you said per month and the landlord wins out. Now all of a sudden you had a 50-50 case. So they say, does that contradict? They say no. Because in other words, each one discussed one case and the story was talking about a different case. So they're saying, just assume there were words missing. And the Mishnah also brought the 3rd case, which is, and this is the one we're going to deal with for the rest of today almost, which is, if you said both, yachloku, because then it's unclear which one did you mean. Did you mean for the year, which would then include that month? Did you mean per month, which it would not include that month and you would have to add it. So since you said both languages, we don't know which one you really meant, or we don't know, right? So we're going to split it 50-50, like we've seen before. And then the Mishnah continues after that line that was missing. We put it back in. So, okay, and then they basically just quote the story, which then proves that line. So what we did is we had to add a line to the Mishnah and claim that that line must have been missing, and that's the transition to the story. But now comes Rav in a very kind of strange manner and says, Amar Rav, if I was there with that story, I would have disagreed with the way they popped in the Mishnah. You have to remember, Rav is a Tanahu Palik. He had status like a Tana because he's the first Amora and he was a great Gadol. He sometimes can disagree with the Mishnah, even though the rules are in general, no one can disagree with the Mishnah. So Rav says, I disagree. If I were there, I would have said for sure you have to pay the maskir. Now, the Gemara says, my kamashon, what's Rav trying to teach us here? Tfos lashon acharon, now you might remember this. What we have here are basically contradictory statements, because one is saying, I'm renting you for the year, and one is saying, I'm renting you per month. Renting you for a year means I include it even if it's going to be a leap year. And renting it for 12 months means I'm not including the leap year. So this person said contradictory statements. Rav says, we follow when you say something and then contradict it a minute later, we go by the last thing you said, because we assume that you're changing your mind about what you said a second ago, and you're saying something different. And therefore, we go by your last statement. And we've seen this in a whole bunch of sugya. And that's what the Gemara is going to say. What, you think Rav is teaching us Tfos Lashon Acharon? That when you say contradictory statements, we go by the last thing you said? Ha'am Rav Chadazimna. He already said it somewhere else. In which case, he doesn't need to repeat it here, even though one could claim maybe he does, because the Mishnah said otherwise. But they're basically claiming we would have known anyway. How do we know? If you say Istera, okay, you say I owe you an Istera. Now, an Istera has 96 coins, 96, let's say, pennies in those days, right? Prutot. So an Istera has 96 prutot. If you say Istera, which is me'amai, and then you say 100 prutot I owe you, which is more than an Istera, me'amai, you have to pay the person 100 prutot. But if you say me'amai Istera, but if you say it in the reverse, I owe you 100 me'a in Istera, then Istera, then you only have to pay 96 because we go by the last thing you said. To which they say, even though Rav said it there, you still might have thought that Rav would have to say it here because they don't exactly contradict. You might have thought that they were saying, I'm talking about an Istera that is worth 100. In other words, maybe 100 bad prutot could be the same as 96 good prutot. Maybe you were saying, you were explaining what your Istera was. But therefore, Rav had to say it here, where you can't say you were explaining what you meant, because these have two totally different meanings. You rent something for a year, you mean even if it'll be a leap year. And if you rent it for 12 months, you mean only 12 months. So Kamash Malan, the Rav says the same thing by us. But you couldn't have necessarily assumed that on your own. That was Rav. Shmuel understands it differently. Shmuel Amar, no, I agree with the Mishnah. The Mishnah is right because the Mishnah is in a unique case. Again, ukimta. The Mishnah is talking about a case where the landlord came to the tenant in the middle of the 13th month and said, listen, you got to either pay me or leave. So what happens then? Yachloku. Why? Because the already half month that passed and the renter lived there without having paid rent is done. If you want to, right? If the maskir wants to get rent for that, the maskir has to prove that that was the arrangement and has no way to prove it. So don't have to pay for the first half month. But the second half month, now that the tenant comes and says, listen, either pay me or leave, if the tenant doesn't leave, the tenant's going to have to pay. Because at this point, the landlord's coming and demanding. So that's the case where yachloku, only if they came in the middle of the month. But ba'b'tchilat hachodesh, kulei lamaskir. If the maskir said it before the 13th month, then of course you're going to have to pay for that 13th month. And ba'b'sof hachodesh, if you already live there and it's the end of the month, well, again, you got to prove. So kulei lasocher, the socher doesn't have to pay anything. And with that, he doesn't disagree with the Mishnah. He just explains the Mishnah in a case where it's the middle of the month. But question, wait a minute. This sounds like he disagrees with Rav. And he doesn't think we go by the last thing you said in a case where there's a contradiction. But Rav Shmuel Amrit Travayu, in a different case, he agrees with Rav. Let's hear. This is a different thing. I'm selling you grains, one core of grains, which is 30 se'ah, for 30 zuzim. Then, since it was a whole package deal, core for 30, this isn't yet Tvos Lashon Acharon, the whole package deal, if I sold you a core b'shloshim and you took 29 of them, I could change my mind at the end because you haven't taken the 30. So I could change my mind and take everything back and say, you know what, I don't really want to sell them. But if I say, core b'shloshim se'ah b'sela, if I say I'm selling you a core for 30, and each se'ah costs a sela, which is like our case where you said the big, right, the whole thing, and then per month. Se'ah b'sela, ani mocher lecha, rishon kana. Since I ended with se'ah b'sela, which means Tvos Lashon Acharon, we go with the last thing you said. As soon as you take each se'ah, you've acquired it because I split the sale into se'ot. So basically, every time you take a se'ah, if I change my mind after 29, I can only change my mind about the last one. The other 29 are already yours. And that seems to say, Tvos Lashon Acharon, we ignore the first thing you said. And that's Shmuel also. So how could Shmuel say we don't? So they say, no, that's different. Because hatam tamamai mishum de tafis, hachanami katafis. Okay, some people have a difference of agreement about which is the hatam, which is the hacha. It doesn't really matter. In the end, it's the same, though, which is both cases we're going to say here. In the case of the house, the socher was already there and lived there. And that's why it's tofes, right? He already had it, and that's why he doesn't have to pay. And we don't say Tvos Lashon Acharon where you set it per month. Also here, he was tofes. In other words, again, you took it, and once you take it, you have it already. They're both based on the same idea. It's not Tvos Lashon Acharon. It's all because once you have it, then if the person wants to take something out of you, the burden of proof is on them. And therefore, he doesn't hold Tvos Lashon Acharon. That situation is for a different reason. Rav Nachman gives a third answer. Karka b'chezka ba'aleha kayemet. He says the maskir is in the right here. And why is that? Because, right, and that's what right, this is actually like Rav. Rav said, Tvos Lashon Acharon, you said month in the end, goes by month, and you have to pay for the 13th month. Rav Nachman says the same thing. You have to pay for the 13th month, but for a different reason. Because the karka is always in the hands of the owner, the landlord. So the landlord always has the upper hand because really it's their land. So my kamashla, Tvos Lashon Acharon hanu de Rav. But in the end, he's saying the same thing as Rav. So why is he saying this is a third opinion? They say, no, afagav da'apik me. Rav said Tvos Lashon Acharon. If it was the reverse and you said every month for this amount and for the year, the whole amount, and you ended with the year, then Rav would say, it goes to the tenant. The tenant wins because you ended with the year. We always go by the last thing you said. According to Rav Nachman, we always side on the maskir side. It doesn't matter which came first. Okay, so those were our three opinions about the case in the Mishnah and what we rule. Now we're going to end with this last question. Ba'ami name Rabbi Yana. They asked Rabbi Yana the following question. Here we're talking about a different socher maskir landlord-tenant issue. Socher omer natati, maskir omer lo natalti. The socher says, I paid you already. And the maskir says, you didn't pay me rent yet. Okay, we're up to the first month's rent. Landlord says, pay up. And you say, what do you mean? I paid you already. So what do we do? Amila haviraya, on who is the burden of proof? To which the Gemara says, Ema, what kind of question is this? If it was before the rent was owed, right? If you normally pay rent at the end, last day of the month, okay, which is something we learned, usually you pay the rent at the end of the month according to halacha. So if you usually, right nowadays we do the reverse, but in those days you pay at the end of the month. If you usually pay at the end of the month and the end of the month hasn't come yet, then we assume you haven't paid. And if it's past the date, then we assume you have paid. And we know this, not just we assume, but Tanina, it says so in the Mishnah. It's not. This is a totally different situation. We have a child, a newborn baby, who's a firstborn, needs to do a pidyon haben, and then the father dies. And we don't know if the father paid the kohen or not, if he did the pidyon haben or not. So meita'av b'toch shloshim yom, if the father dies within 30 days, the burden of proof is to prove, unless you can prove that he paid, we assume you didn't pay because most people don't pay until the day they're supposed to pay. If it's after 30 days, we assume it was paid until we know it wasn't. So it should be the same thing here. If it's past the date you owe the money, then we assume the tenant is right. If it's before the day you owe the money, we assume the landlord's right and you have to pay. And again, the burden of proof relies on the other side. So to which they say, what about the day the rent is due? That's the question. Do we assume on that day you've already paid from the beginning of the day or not? And that's the question, and we're going to see an answer tomorrow. So quick review of our daf. We started with the mezuzah, who has to put up a mezuzah, and the issue of that you really can't take it down. Then we talked about the zevel and what the case is, and we assume when you rent a house, you don't generally rent out the chatzer unless you specifically did. This proves also the fact that the zevel goes to the baal bayit, that your chatzer is kona even if you don't know. That we said supports Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina. We brought three difficulties against him and resolved them. Then we got to the house rented for the year or for the months. And then what about the case where you said both? The Mishnah said Yachloku. Rav says, I don't agree with that halacha. I would have said Tfos Lashon Acharon. And then we had two other opinions. Shmuel that did Nukimta to the Mishnah that was in the middle of the month. And then Rav Nachman, who said we always side with the owner of the house. And then we had this question of Rabbi Yanai, what happens when we have a debate about paying? And then we said, it depends what day. And then we said, well, we're talking about the day of the rental payment is due. And guy says he paid, and the landlord says you didn't pay. What do we do? A good, relevant question, right? Maybe you should always get things in writing. That would have resolved the issue. Okay, with that, we'll end for today. Wishing everyone a good day and hope to have more good news in the days to come.